Today I'm going to walk you through an activity called Smart Sentencing. This activity comes from Helen Sword's book titled Air and Light in Time and Space, How Successful Academics Write. And this activity really is a great practice thinking about the word choice that you use in your writing. Some of you may have done an activity similar to this before. It'll kind of take you back to maybe high school when you really focused on your use of nouns and verbs. But as Helen points out in her book, even though this can seem a bit more of an elementary type activity, it's really great to get you thinking about the clarity in your work. As we proceed through this workshop or through this studio of sorts, I'm going to move at a quicker pace than many of you will need to as you work. So please feel free to pause at any point and then come back when you are ready, because depending upon the example that you choose out of your own writing, it may take you longer than I have set aside. So the first thing you need to do before we get started is, if you do not have it already, pull up an example of your writing. This can be something you're currently working on, something you've worked on in the past. It's better if you have something in printed form. You only need one page because we're only going to be focusing on one sentence per se for today. So if you don't already have a printed copy of something that you are currently writing, then pause this video, go pull out or go print a page out of something you're currently writing or something that you wrote recently, and then you can proceed through this workshop. So as we start looking at sentence diagnostics, which is going to be the purpose of what we're doing today, it's making you think about how you normally write. Are you normally a long sentence writer, a short sentence writer? Or do you balance? What is your kind of default or your tendency when you write? And to start looking at that, I want you to choose, just at random, a good chunky looking paragraph in your writing. This could be in your introduction, it could be in your discussion, it can be anywhere in your example of writing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't even have to be an academic example. That's up to you. But just choose at random a good chunky looking paragraph. Don't overthink it. Don't worry about if it's the longest paragraph or not. And then within that paragraph, select the longest sentence. So again, you don't need to count the words. Just look through that paragraph and find a sentence that seems long. And then once you've done that, I want you to count the number of words in the sentence. Keep in mind, there is nothing intrinsically good or bad about sentence length. It's more about the variety of sentence length that you use. So if, for example, you tend to lean towards short sentences, then sometimes writing with a lot of short sentences can seem a bit monotonous, where if you're like me, and if you're not careful, your sentences are very long, then there's a higher chance that people will find your writing or my writing more difficult to read, primarily because you're trying to cram a lot of information into one syntactical or grammatical unit. So usually when your sentences are very long, like mine, there are multiple sets of sentences or ideas that need to be untangled. Now, I do want to caveat and say, if you write a lot of very long sentences, but you do it on purpose, it's very intentional, and you're in complete control of your writing, and it's easy for your audience to understand, then great. I love long sentences. But if you're just writing long sentences because that's your tendency and it's not out of choice, then it's a good idea to unpack those sentences and figure out what's going on. And that's the point of our exercise today, to help you become more aware of your sentence length, the length of sentences that you tend to default towards in your writing. And then as you think about sentence length, becoming more aware of the variety that you use and considering to vary your sentence length because that's what makes you a stylistic writer. So now that you have chosen your sentence and you've counted the number of words in that sentence, you can write that number down somewhere. If we were all together, I would ask you how many words were in your sentence. It's very interesting when I do this activity in a live type audience where people will say like, you know, I have 35 words or I have 40 words. And this is not like to see who has the longest sentence. Often sentences with 50 to 60 to even 70 words are very common. So don't feel like you're an incredibly wordy writer just because you have a long sentence, but it's a great activity to kind of walk you through thinking about what your sentence length looks like. Now, as we proceed, I'm going to ask you, if you don't have it readily available next to you, if you'll go get a bunch of different colored utensils. If you're writing on if you have a paper copy of your sentence. If you don't, then you can use the tools within your word processing document. There are lots of highlighting colors and underlining and italics and other things. But this activity works really well if you have that tactile element to it. So if you don't have readily available, go scrounge up as many highlighters and colored pens as you can find, and then we can continue this activity. So we're going to start by highlighting the verbs in your sentence, so just your sentence. And if you kind of think back to when you first learned parts of speech, verbs are those action words that you can visualize. So it doesn't matter what tense they're in, count each verb, highlight each verb separately, even if they run together, because we really want to think about the verbs that you're using. And then within those verbs that you're highlighting, that also includes be verbs. So is, are, was, were, be, been, being. There's kind of a stigma around be verbs and academia. And be verbs are essential to our English language. We use them all the time when we speak, but they are passive. And in our writing, we want to be more active. So being aware of the passive forms of verbs that you use. For example, like mistakes were made. When we say things like mistakes were made, we take away that agency. We take away who is doing the action. So we want more action verbs. And if I were able to see all of you and you were able to see me, if I asked you how many of you have at least one be verb in your sentence, chances are most of you will raise your hand. And it's not that be verbs are bad. I don't mean to imply that be verbs are bad, but it is important that we try to eliminate all the be verbs that we can. I have another activity where I walk you through how to edit. And one of those things we edit for are be verbs. So try to use action. Don't take the agency out of what you are writing. Say who is doing the action and take out those passive verbs. And then the other thing I want you to highlight are any fresh, unusual verbs that you use. And this is kind of up to you, what you consider to be unusual. We tend to use the same verbs over and over again. Understand, recognize, explain, those verbs in academia that we try to use to clarify our writing. But as readers, think of how excited we get when we come across a verb that's unique and it makes us stop and go, that was interesting. What exactly was the author trying to say? It makes us review and read the writing through a little bit of a different lens. So if you don't have any unusual verbs, that's okay. Try to put some in if you think of any, but unusual verbs are good. And then the third thing I want you to highlight or underline or whatever color choice, pick a different color choice at the moment, are any words that you can visualize. So actions that you can visualize. And when Helen Sword talks about this activity in her book, she mentions that she conceptualizes action words you can visualize or are verbs that you can use a hand gesture to emulate. So anything, if I can demonstrate it using my hands, then those are action verbs that I can visualize. And the idea behind this is thinking about concrete versus abstract verbs. As much as possible, we want to use concrete verbs. We want to use concrete nouns as well. I'll get to that in a little bit, but we want to use concrete verbs. We want to use verbs that people can see, that they can visualize, that they can kind of put themselves in the position. Because the more we can make our writing concrete, the easier it is for our audience to understand. And so kind of this is what you have highlighted at the moment is your look at verbs. What verbs are you using in your writing? Are they active verbs versus passive verbs? Are you using more concrete verbs that you can actually visualize? Or are you using more abstract verbs that is difficult for someone to see? Like, for example, love. Love is an action, can be, but it is more abstract. It is difficult for you. There's not really a hand gesture for love. There's sign language for love, obviously, but there's not necessarily a specific hand gesture for love. And love is not something that you can necessarily visualize. You know the outcomes of love, you know kind of what love, acts of love look like, but love itself is difficult to visualize. So now we're going to move on to nouns. So using a different color, highlight the nouns. So our nouns are person, place, or thing. Kind of at its basics, nouns are words that you can put a in front of, or you can add an s to it at the end to make it plural. We will count each one separately again, even compound nouns. So think about compound nouns if you have like separation anxiety, where separation modifies anxiety. Highlight them separately. Count them both as different nouns because they may be used in different ways. Part of the reason that we highlight nouns is often a high number of nouns in a sentence will make it difficult for your reader to keep track of the nouns, keep track of what's happening, or who it's happening to, I guess, since we're talking about nouns. So looking at your nouns, just kind of make note, how many nouns do you have in your sentence? And then also take note, either circle or highlight a different color or underline or something you haven't done before, any unique or unexpected nouns. Again, kind of that same idea behind using words that we don't often use. And I like when I'm reading articles for research, I make note of a lot of things when I read that are not at all for the topic I'm researching. But if I come across examples of good writing, I make notes of those so I can come back to them later to use as inspiration for my writing. Or if I find unique or unexpected verbs or unique or unexpected nouns, then I will make note of those as well. You can kind of keep a word wall or a word list of sorts so that I'm enhancing my own use of words as I go. The next thing I want you to underline or highlight is concrete nouns. So concrete nouns is something that you experience with your senses. So concrete verbs are something that you could visualize. Concrete nouns are something you experience with your senses. So things that you can see, or you can hear, or you can touch, or you can taste. And then there's feel, also feels a little more difficult. Kind of when we go back to love, because love can be a noun or a verb. So if you look at love as a noun form, you can't touch love. Now you can feel love, but feel, as far as we're talking about senses, feel can mean two different things, as we all know. So I can feel that my desk is smooth, but I can't feel what, necessarily the tangible, tactile aspects of love. And so since we can't touch love, it's abstract. And it's harder for us as readers to keep track of abstract concepts, to keep track of abstract nouns. And I would challenge you to take this even a step further. As you look at the nouns that you're using, a lot of us fall into situations where we use kind of nouns in a more broad sense. So we talk about patients or students or individuals or athletes. And I challenge you to think about, when we use nouns in that manner, are they really concrete? Is a patient a concrete noun? Yes, I can see a patient, but I can see particular or specific patients. When I'm talking about patients as a whole, the people that are in the waiting room per se, then is that really a concrete noun? So thinking about, how can you make your nouns more concrete? Things that you can experience with your senses, because again, concrete nouns and concrete verbs are easier to understand. And then the last noun piece I want you to annotate in some way are nominalizations. Helen Sword calls them zombie nouns. So zombie nouns are those nouns that we have, are those words that we have turned into nouns. Okay, so they used to be verbs like educate, and we turned it into education, or instruct, and we turned it into instruction, or develop, and we turned it into development. In the English language, we have kind of a tendency to take these beautiful action verbs and zombleize them. I don't know if that's a word. I'm making up a word. As Helen Sword puts it, and we turn them into nouns when actually they should be verbs. Helen has a fantastic video, and that's where this skeleton picture is a nod to. You go on YouTube and you search for zombie nouns by Helen Sword. She has a beautiful video that kind of walks you through how you take those verbs that you've turned into nouns and turn them back into verbs to make your action much more transparent and make your writing more active. So find those words, and I put some common suffixes up here that we use when we create zombie nouns. So words that end in ants or ints or ty or mint or ism or ness or ion. Check for those nouns and see which of those, so highlight them or underline, whatever you need to do, and see which of those should be verbs that you have turned into nouns. How many zombie nouns do you have in your writing? Because the more zombie nouns you have, the more your reader has to struggle. And this does not mean you have to get rid of all of them. You just have to think about, is this word better in its verb form? Like, for example, education. Well, education is in itself a noun. It has become a very clear thing. So I'm not going to turn every instance of education in my writing into educate. It wouldn't make any sense. But develop and development. There may be times where develop is much more appropriate than the zombie noun form, development. So I want to show you an example to make you think about how we can make our writing more clear. So this subject verb object idea is a way of writing that is known to be easier for readers to understand. And scientists who believe in research in clarity and precision, and all of us who believe in research in clarity and precision, should be bringing that science of cognitive psychology to our writing. So a couple of years ago, and I put the source down there, Goffin and Swan wrote this beautiful article called The Science of Scientific Writing. And in it, they included this sentence. So bees disperse pollen. Very, very simple sentence. You have the subject, which is bees. You have the verb, which is disperse. And you have pollen, which is the object that is being dispersed. You can immediately visualize what's happening in this sentence. It's not complex. You have two concrete nouns, the bees and the pollen, that are being described thanks to a very concrete verb. Where when you include more passive voice, then the writing itself becomes much more complicated. So pollen is dispersed by bees. You have that is, which is a be verb, that passive voice, which creates this disjunction of sorts between the action and the agent, because the object becomes the subject. As you're looking, pollen is dispersed by bees, all of a sudden, your object, pollen, becomes what you're talking about. It becomes the subject. And that's not at all what was intended to happen. And so if we can stick to the subject, verb, object kind of structure as much as possible, we get the same message, but it is much more clear. So here's another example I want you to look at, and Helen uses this example in her book. Both of these pieces of text were taken from a systematic biology journal. And so if you have this first sentence, it says insects suck, chew, parasitize, bore, store, and even cultivate their foods to a highly sophisticated degree of specialization. So if we break this down, you have, again, thinking about that subject, verb, object. Your subject is insects. There's a beautiful list of verbs that you can visualize. These are concrete verbs. And then you have your object, which is another concrete noun. So the second example was in the same volume of the journal. And if you look, it says determining the extent of shared evolutionary history between two members of an associated requires the determination of the phylogenes of both groups of organisms with sufficient confidence to make robust inferences. So if you're having a difficult time finding the subject and the verb and the object in this statement, you are not alone. So I'm going to break this down with you a little bit. So determining is actually our subject. ING words can be a subject. They're actually called gerunds. And similar to our zombie nouns, they ate up the subject. Because we don't have the agent here. Like, who's determining? Well, we don't know, but this is the subject. So this is that gerund, obviously not a concrete word in any sorts. And then as we continue reading, it takes us a while to get to the verb. Well, the verb is requires. So you're reading through and you're like, okay, what's the verb? What's the action? What's being done? Well, the verb is required. And if you look between determining and requires, It says the extent of shared evolutionary history between two members of an associated. And there should even be group in there, probably, but regardless. All of the text that is between determining and requires are describing what's being determined. So that's where that disconnect. And then as you read and you're trying to figure out, well, what is being determined? Well, it's determination. So if you think about this, what this author is saying is that determining requires determination. Well, thanks for that. There's a whole lot of words for us as a reader to try to figure out that determining requires determination. And for me, that, and as Helen points out in some of her examples, that's laziness. Because the author could have done a much better job of using concrete words to take the reader to a place where it was much easier to understand the message that was being delivered. And someone has to do the hard work of building that bridge between the reader and the writer. Who is going to help the reader understand what the writer is trying to say? And I, as does Helen Sword, believe it's the writer's job. We can't just throw out all of these words and expect the reader to figure it out. That's not how this works. And in this example, that agent, like I said, is lost. The doer is lost. Back to the old adage you may have heard in high school, like, who is kicking whom? You know, as you're thinking about figuring out the nouns and the verbs, who is kicking whom? Well, I think it is whoever is determining. Whoever that person is determining. And so being in control of your nouns and your verbs is crucial to your stylistic writing, to have a piece of writing that makes sense to your reader. So a couple of concepts to remember. Make sure, you know, as you're looking at that sentence that you highlighted and you picked apart, and you may want to go back and do this with other sentences, and you may already feel an itch to fix the one sentence that you've been working on. But really try to use concrete language. Don't fall into a trap of using abstract language. Use those concrete verbs and nouns as much as you can. Really think about your subject-verb agreement versus your agent-action kind of connection. You know, what is being said by the words that you use? When you can, keep nouns and verbs close together. So if we go back to this example, you know, we have our two examples where our nouns and our verbs in the first example are very close together. And in the second example, we had to spend a much longer time picking apart the nouns and the verbs. Keep your nouns and your verbs together. In some work that I do with Pat Goodson, she often says along the lines of, if the words are not where they if the words are not with the words they belong, then they belong with the words they're with the idea behind it being, if you don't pay attention to the order of the words you use, then your reader is going to make their own determination about what you mean. So be clear and put your subjects and verbs together so the reader does not have to imply what you mean by the subject-verb connection that you are including. Now, on her website, Helen Sword has this beautiful, beautiful tool called the Writer's Diet that in some ways does the activity that we just did. Okay. If you go to thewritersdiet.com, or you can just search for it, Writer's Diet Helen Sword, you can put in your own writing. She actually just created an extension for Word. so that it can automatically test the fitness of your writing within Words. You don't have to upload it to the website, but you can upload it to the website. And this website does a lot of what we just did. So it pays attention to the number of verbs you use, nouns, prepositions, adjectives, adverbs, and then your be verbs. It either goes further down, it will talk to you about zombie nouns and other things. And so it helps you think about the words you're using, and if your writing is as strong as it could be. So I encourage you to go to the website. The website also works very well with Helen Sword's book called The Writer's Diet. So it's a great one if you're looking for another book to get in addition to the book I mentioned at the beginning of this workshop. But feel free to play around with her Writer's Diet test and see how your writing measures up. So I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions or if you need any follow-up on what we talked about today, just let me know.